They didn't just fire me, they erased me. 27 years of loyalty, dedication, and hard-earned relationships gone in under 10 minutes. I sat in the sleek, soulless conference room, listening as the words cut through the air like a sharpened blade. Restructuring, business decision, nothing personal. The carefully curated language of corporate indifference, the kind designed to soften the blow, as if reducing my career to a calculated expense made it any less brutal. I had been with Henderson & Co. since its early days, back when it was just another ambitious consulting firm trying to break into the industry. I had helped build its reputation, cultivated its most lucrative client relationships, and ensured that the firm wasn't just another name on a contract, it was a trusted partner. My role wasn't transactional, it was personal. But none of that mattered. Not to the new leadership, not to the latest round of efficiency-driven decision-making. I wasn't being let go because I had failed. I was being let go because my experience had become too expensive. The company wasn't prioritizing expertise or relationships anymore. It was prioritizing numbers. And I had become a number that no longer fit into their equation. A manila folder was pushed across the table, a severance package offering a brief financial cushion before I was expected to disappear. 2 months' salary and continuation of benefits through the end of the quarter. That was the sum total of 27 years. Janice from HR sat stiffly beside them, nodding mechanically, avoiding my eyes, as if her silence absolved her of complicity. Then came the final insult. Security was waiting outside the room. It took a moment for the weight of it to sink in. I had written that protocol myself a decade ago, designed for employees who had compromised the integrity of the firm, for those caught in scandals, fraud, or corporate espionage. It was a safeguard, a precaution. It was never supposed to be for people like me. I had dedicated my life to ensuring this firm thrived, and now I was being escorted out like a criminal. The walk to my office felt longer than ever. Each step carried the weight of years of late nights spent poring over client data, of early mornings drafting proposals, of weekends sacrificed to reassure executives who had trusted me with their business. I passed colleagues who knew exactly what was happening but wouldn't meet my gaze. Some stared at their screens with forced intensity, pretending they hadn't seen me, while others cast brief, pitying glances before quickly looking away. No one spoke. No one dared. Because if it could happen to me, it could happen to any of them. At my desk, I moved on autopilot, methodically packing my things, the frame photo from last year's industry gala, the handwritten thank you notes from clients who had once sworn they'd never work with anyone else. The Crystal Award I had received for 25 years of service, now reduced to nothing more than a paperweight. Each item told a story of commitment, of trust built over decades. But none of those stories mattered now. The firm had decided they could be rewritten without me. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Julia Carter, the CEO of Carter Global Solutions, one of the firm's biggest clients. She had heard rumors and she wanted to know what was going on. That was when it hit me. Henderson & Coben thought my clients would simply transfer over, that relationships built on trust and loyalty could be reassigned, like names in a database. But they had made a critical miscalculation. The company's value wasn't in its branding, or its leadership, or even its bottom line. Its true value had always been in the relationships that I had spent years cultivating. And relationships like that couldn't be reassigned. As I picked up my box and walked toward the exit, I realized something. The firm believed they had just eliminated an expense, but what they had really done was sever themselves from the very foundation of what had made them successful. And that was a mistake they wouldn't fully understand until it was too late. 3 days had passed since the world I had built came crashing down. I sat in my apartment, surrounded by the remnants of my career, the framed awards, the stack of business cards, the handwritten notes from clients I had fought to keep. The silence was suffocating, a stark contrast to the rhythmic hum of the office that had once been my second home. 27 years reduced to nothing in under 10 minutes. My laptop screen glowed in front of me, flooded with notifications. LinkedIn had become a circus, former colleagues expressing shock, recruiters circling like vultures, industry connections reaching out under the guise of concern but hungry for gossip. My inbox overflowed with messages from clients who had heard whispers of my departure. But they weren't contacting Henderson and Co. They were contacting me. I scrolled through the names, each one more familiar than the last. Julia Carter, Douglas Hale, Belinda Shaw, some of the firm's biggest accounts. None of them trusted Henderson's leadership to tell them the truth. They wanted answers from me. That was the first crack in the illusion. Nathan Caldwell had assumed my exit would be just another personnel change. He had underestimated the weight of my name, the years of trust embedded in every handshake, every contract renewal, every late-night reassurance to clients who had come to rely on me. He thought I was replaceable, but the people who mattered didn't agree. I stared at the job sites open on my screen, a dozen tabs of companies hiring, firms looking for senior leadership. I had been discarded so effortlessly, swept aside as though my value had an expiration date. The reality was setting in. Loyalty in business is a one-way street. The first call came that evening. Julia Carter. She wasn't one to waste time on pleasantries. Her voice was sharp, laced with irritation. A junior associate had reached out, introducing themselves as her new relationship manager. She was livid. She hadn't been consulted, hadn't been warned. She had trusted me, and now Henderson had replaced me without so much as a conversation. I listened, absorbing her frustration, knowing that this was only the beginning. Julia Carter wasn't just a client. She was a signal. If she pulled her business, others would follow. By the next morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Emails flooded in from executives, partners, and department heads from companies I had worked with for years. Some were worried, some were furious, all of them blindsided. Nathan Caldwell hadn't thought past the decision to cut me loose. He hadn't anticipated the fallout. And then came the call I hadn't expected. James Henderson. I almost let it go to voicemail. He had been overseas for weeks, working on an expansion deal far removed from the day-to-day operations of the firm. But curiosity got the better of me. His voice was tight, controlled, the frustration barely masked beneath the polished tone. He had just landed from London and had been blindsided by the news. My termination had not been authorized by him. He was furious. For a moment, I let myself believe it mattered. That maybe, just maybe, there had been a mistake, that he still saw my worth, that this could be undone. But then I heard it. He didn't want to fix this for me. He wanted me to fix this for him. Nathan Caldwell had made a mess of things. Clients were panicking, the firm's reputation was cracking, and Henderson needed me to patch the holes before the ship sank. His offer was clear. Come back, reinstate my position, call it a miscommunication. But it wasn't a miscommunication. It was a choice that had shown me exactly where I stood. I declined. For 27 years, I had built something they didn't think twice about discarding. And now, with everything crumbling, they wanted me to hold it together for them. The irony was suffocating. I hung up the phone and closed my laptop. The job sites, the recruiter emails, the list of firms looking for someone like me, they could wait. I had spent my career believing my worth was tied to Henderson and Koda, but the past 3 days had shown me the truth. I wasn't valuable because of my title. I was valuable because of my name. And now it was time to see just how much that name was really worth. The calls came faster than I could process them. Recruiters, industry executives, even competitors who had once treated me as nothing more than a name on an email thread, all now vying for my attention. Within days, I had received multiple offers, each one more lucrative than the last, all promising higher salaries, greater autonomy, and, for the first time in my career, true partnership. I wasn't surprised. Henderson & Co. had treated my termination as nothing more than a numbers game. But the industry knew my value. My name carried weight, and now everyone wanted a piece of it. But I didn't rush. The old version of me, the one who had believed loyalty mattered, who had spent decades thinking my worth was tied to the firm I had built, would have panicked, scrambled to accept the safest option, the most familiar path. But that version of me had been fired 3 days ago. This version of me was watching and waiting. Blackwood Consulting stood out from the offers piling up on my desk. A mid-sized firm with values reminiscent of what Henderson used to be before it became obsessed with efficiency over relationships. They were expanding, looking to bring in high-level talent, and they saw me as the missing piece. I met with them in their Manhattan office, the atmosphere a stark contrast to the cold corporate sterility of Henderson's glass towers. There was no scripted empathy, no buzzwords meant to soften a ruthless agenda, just an honest discussion about what they wanted and what I could bring. They didn't just want my skills, they wanted my influence, my client relationships, my name. That's when I understood something critical. Henderson had let me go, assuming my value was tied to them, but in reality, they had only ever been valuable because of me. While I was weighing my options, Nathan Caldwell was drowning. It started with small tremors, clients expressing concern over my absence, asking questions Henderson wasn't prepared to answer. Julia Carter, the firm's most high-profile client, demanded a meeting with the executive team, livid that she had been assigned a junior associate without her consent. Her dissatisfaction wasn't an isolated incident. Other major accounts began reviewing their contracts, scheduling audits, scrutinizing the fine print. Moves that signaled one thing: they were considering leaving. Henderson had built its empire on reputation and trust, and both were beginning to fracture. The industry noticed. I received a call from a well-connected journalist who had been following the firm's trajectory for years. He had caught wind of client unrest, internal instability, and sudden leadership tensions. Henderson was no longer the impenetrable powerhouse it once appeared to be. He wanted my take on it. I declined to comment. I had no interest in revenge, no desire to publicly tear down what I had spent years building. But I didn't need to. Henderson was doing that all on its own. The final blow came from inside the firm. My former assistant, someone I had mentored, someone who had seen firsthand how leadership had changed under Nathan Caldwell, leaked a series of internal emails. Nothing damning on its own, but together they painted a clear picture. Clients were panicking. The board was divided. Henderson was bleeding, and no one had a plan to stop it. Nathan Caldwell, once confident, was now scrambling. He had built his power on the illusion of control, assuming that clients were tied to the firm itself, not to the people who had cultivated those relationships. He had been wrong. Henderson was no longer the trusted institution it once had been. The cracks in its foundation were widening, and it was only a matter of time before the walls caved in completely. While the firm I had built was burning from the inside, I sat back and watched. For the first time in my career, I wasn't the one holding up a company that didn't deserve me. Instead, I was building something new. Blackwood Consulting's offer remained on the table, but I waited. I wanted to see just how much further Henderson would fall before I made my move. It didn't take long. By the end of the week, clients weren't just questioning their contracts anymore. They were actively looking for ways out. Julia Carter's team had already started evaluating competitors. Douglas Hale had halted a pending contract renewal. Nathan hadn't just lost their confidence, he had lost their trust. The industry was watching. And so was I. This wasn't sabotage, this was gravity. And for the first time, I wasn't the one being pulled down, I was the one rising. The unraveling happened faster than anyone could have predicted. At first, it was subtle. Clients quietly asking questions, contracts suddenly coming under review, a nervous undercurrent spreading through industry circles. But then, like a fault line finally giving way, the cracks in Henderson and Conan widened until the foundation began to crumble. 28 of the firm's top clients, the ones who had once been the bedrock of its success, formally signed a letter demanding Nathan Caldwell's resignation. It wasn't just a complaint. It was a statement of no confidence, a clear declaration that Henderson was no longer a firm they trusted. The firm's boardroom turned into chaos. Investors, who had once viewed Henderson as a safe bet, began pulling out. Stockholders grew restless, asking how a company that had stood strong for decades could suddenly be on the brink of collapse, but the answer was simple. They had cut away the one thing holding it all together. James Henderson, the man whose name was on the doors, watched as his empire imploded. I wasn't there to see it firsthand, but I didn't need to be. I heard the whispers, read the reports, watched as the industry reacted. The leadership team scrambled to control the damage. But this wasn't just a crisis, it was a reckoning. Then the press got involved. The Wall Street Journal called me first, their reporter careful, deliberate, probing for insights into what was happening behind closed doors. They had already heard about the client revolt, the investor panic, the leadership in free fall. They wanted my take, a direct quote to confirm the rumors. I could have said a lot of things. I could have spoken the truth, exposed the reality of how Henderson had devalued the very people who had built its success. I could have watched them burn in real time. But I didn't. I declined to comment. Not because I owed Henderson any loyalty. That had died the moment they escorted me out of the building like I was a security risk. But because I didn't need to say anything at all. The damage was already done. Nathan Caldwell had been so sure of himself, so convinced that the future of the firm rested in efficiency and cost-cutting rather than relationships and trust. But he had made one crucial miscalculation. He had underestimated the people who had built that trust. Clients weren't just questioning Henderson now. They were leaving. Board members, once aligned with Nathan's vision, began turning against him. An emergency meeting was called, an internal vote put forward to determine whether he should remain as managing partner. The vote was unanimous. Nathan was out. It should have felt like a victory, like justice served, but I didn't allow myself the satisfaction, because in the end, it wasn't my actions that led to this moment. Henderson had done it to itself. Then the call came. James Henderson, his voice no longer filled with the confidence that had once made him untouchable. There was something else there now, desperation. He offered me everything. Full partnership, complete autonomy, the power to reshape the firm, to bring it back to what it had once been. For a brief second, I thought of the years I had spent there, the clients I had fought for, the legacy I had built. It would have been so easy to step back into the role, to be the one to fix the mess they had created. But then I remembered the way they had discarded me like a liability. They didn't want me back because they had learned their lesson. They wanted me back because they needed someone to clean up the wreckage, and I wasn't that person anymore. So I refused. The firm that had once been my home was now nothing more than a cautionary tale, and for the first time I felt nothing but relief. This wasn't my problem anymore, and it never would be again. The fall of Henderson and Company was no longer a quiet implosion. It was a spectacle. The industry had been watching, taking notes, learning from their mistakes in real time. Clients who had once trusted the firm without question were now distancing themselves, unwilling to tether their futures to a sinking ship. Investors, no longer willing to gamble on unstable leadership, demanded immediate change. What had once been a pillar of the industry was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, I had moved on. Blackwood Consulting's offer had been sitting in front of me for days, and now, with the landscape shifting so dramatically, they were more aggressive than ever. They weren't just offering me a position, they were handing me a seat at the table, a partnership, a say in the future of a firm that still understood what Henderson had forgotten. But what sealed my decision wasn't just the offer itself, it was what Blackwood was planning. They weren't just expanding. They were making a move on Henderson. With new investment backing, Blackwood was set to acquire a controlling interest in the very firm that had discarded me, not out of spite, not as an act of vengeance, but as a strategic decision, one that would allow them to absorb Henderson's crumbling assets, its remaining clients, its infrastructure, and reshape it under their own leadership. And now they wanted me to oversee the transition. The irony wasn't lost on me. Nathan Caldwell, who had so confidently eliminated me in the name of progress, now stood on the edge of complete professional ruin. The board had turned against him, and with Blackwood now in control, he had no allies left. His removal was swift, his legacy reduced to nothing. Henderson and Konu, the firm I had given my life to, no longer existed. It had been absorbed, rebranded, and rebuilt. Not by me, not out of revenge, but because they had made themselves obsolete. I had never needed to destroy them. They had done it to themselves. The moment the acquisition was finalized, my role shifted. I was no longer the discarded executive, the expendable employee forced to watch from the sidelines. Now, I was in a position of power, one where every decision I made influenced the future of what was left of Henderson. The first few weeks were a blur of board meetings, integration plans, and negotiations. Clients who had once been hesitant about leaving Henderson were now reaching out, relieved that the firm was under new leadership. Some had already signed new contracts with Blackwood before the deal had even been announced. Others, still wary, were waiting to see how things played out. But one thing was clear, Henderson's name carried no weight anymore. It wasn't a hostile takeover. There was no need for that. The firm had already crumbled under its own failures. All Blackwood had to do was pick up the pieces. Nathan, of course, didn't go quietly. He fought, grasping for anything that could salvage his reputation. But there was nothing left for him to hold on to. He had burned too many bridges, underestimated too many people. By the time the board made it official, he was little more than an afterthought. I had wondered if I would feel anything when it happened. Satisfaction, justice, a sense of victory. But when the announcement was made and Nathan's name was stripped from every office, every document, every piece of branding, I felt nothing. Because this was never about him. This was about proving to myself that I was never just a name on a payroll, that I was never defined by Henderson or the title they had taken from me, that my worth wasn't something they could determine. The people who had tried to erase me no longer mattered, and I had never mattered more. 6 months had passed. 6 months since I had walked out of Henderson and Co. Band for the last time. Since I had watched the firm unravel from a distance, and since I had stepped into a new chapter of my life, one where I was finally in control. Now I sat in my office high above the city, overlooking the skyline that had once felt like a distant dream, but was now my reality. Blackwood Franklin Consulting, the firm that had once been an ambitious competitor, was now the leading force in the industry. The acquisition of Henderson had been seamless, not because the transition had been easy, but because clients wanted to follow me. Everything Henderson had once stood for, the relationships, the trust, the long-term vision, had been absorbed into something better, something stronger. It was no longer about salvaging a failing company. It was about building something new from the ashes of the old. And then James Henderson called. I wasn't surprised. His name had been disappearing from industry conversations, his influence fading with each passing day. He no longer owned the firm he had built, no longer commanded the respect he once did. He had become an afterthought in an industry that had already moved on. He wanted a meeting. I agreed, not out of obligation, not out of any lingering attachment to the past, but because I wanted to see the man who had once held all the power now standing on the outside looking in. When he arrived, he looked different. Not broken, not defeated, but changed. The weight of his mistakes, of the firm's downfall, had settled on his shoulders. He no longer carried himself with the quiet arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. He was here because he had no other options. He made his case. He wanted a role, some way to stay involved, to be a part of what Blackwood Franklin was building. He wasn't asking for control. He knew that was no longer possible. But he wanted a seat at the table, a way back into the game. I listened, and when he finished, I slid a contract across the table. A consulting role. Limited power, no influence, just a paycheck. For a moment, he hesitated. Maybe he had expected me to refuse outright. Maybe he had hoped for some version of redemption. But there was nothing left to negotiate. He had a choice: accept what was offered or walk away with nothing, and so he signed. As he left my office, I didn't feel satisfaction or triumph. There was no moment of celebration, no need for revenge, because this was never about revenge. I had never needed to destroy Henderson and Co. I had never needed to fight, to prove anything, to force anyone to see my worth. I had simply waited, and in the end, they had destroyed themselves. The firm had failed because it had forgotten what made it valuable in the first place. Not the name, not the executives, not the numbers on a balance sheet. It had failed because it had lost the relationships that held it together. And now I was exactly where I was meant to be. Not as an employee, not as someone waiting to be given an opportunity, but as someone who knew her worth and refused to let anyone else define it again. Elaine's story is a powerful reminder that loyalty in business is often one-sided, and knowing your own worth is the greatest asset you can have. Too often, employees dedicate years, sometimes decades, to companies that view them as nothing more than an expense to be reduced when convenient. Her downfall wasn't due to incompetence or failure, but because leadership failed to see her true value. This happens in many industries today. Companies restructure, positions are eliminated, and hardworking individuals are cast aside in the name of efficiency. But like Elaine, those who invest in relationships, skills, and reputation often land on their feet, not because they seek revenge, but because their worth extends beyond a job title. The key lesson here is simple. Never tie your entire identity to a company. Build your own brand. Cultivate relationships that go beyond your job. Be indispensable not to your employer, but to your industry. If you suddenly lost your position tomorrow, would people follow you, or would they forget you? Loyalty is admirable, but loyalty to yourself must come first. The moment you realize your value isn't tied to where you work, but to what you bring. you take back control. Your journey is shaped by knowing your worth. If this story spoke to you, consider subscribing for more inspiring stories and insights.